Hey coders! Today we are going to learn the basics of CSS. Also, I am going to share some coding best practices related to do's and don'ts in CSS. So let's start with the basics. What is CSS? CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets. It is not a programming language, it is a styling language. It's used to style and customize our HTML to look pleasant and professional. There are three ways for adding CSS to our HTML: inline CSS, internal CSS, and external CSS. So let's talk about all of these methods one by one. In the last video, we talked about HTML5 and we laid down a basic foundation for it. Today we are going to continue with that same foundation and start building on it. If you haven't seen the last video, I recommend pausing this one and going back and watching it. I will leave a link at the top and in the description. The first method we are going to talk about is inline CSS. Inline CSS is when we are adding a style attribute to the HTML element itself. So let's add some inline CSS to our h1 title. I'm going to write style, tab, color, and I'm going to specify green. Save it. And there it is, our heading color changed to green. So this is called a CSS rule. Color is a CSS property and green is a CSS value. And with this semicolon, we separate the styles. The next method to add CSS to our HTML is the internal CSS. The internal CSS is when we are adding a style tag inside our head section, right over here. I'm going to write style, tab, enter. And inside, because we are not adding this style to the HTML tag itself, first we need to specify which element we want to style. So let's say we want to style our h2, and we are going to say h2, two curly brackets, and inside these curly brackets we're going to type in the CSS rule, color, colon, and I'm going to write blue. Let's save it, and our heading 2 changed to a blue color. The last method to add CSS is called the external method. External CSS is when we create a separate CSS file and we import it in the head section. In our first project, let's create a new folder called CSS. Inside this CSS folder, we are going to create a new file called main.css, enter, and we created our CSS file. Now let's import it to the HTML. After the title, I'm going to write link, and I'm going to choose link CSS. At the href, I'm going to type main.css. Oh yes, we have to specify that it's located in our CSS folder, and we are looking for the main.css file. So it's in our CSS folder, the main CSS file. I'm going to save this. Nothing will happen because we didn't add any styles to our main CSS. So let's go there and add some styles to it. Let's say h3 curly brackets, color, orange, and I'm going to save it. And there we go. We imported our main CSS inside our HTML and it works. So let's talk about what we see here. h3 is called the selector. This curly bracket is called a declaration start. Color, it's a CSS property. Our colon is a separator, and orange is the value of our CSS property. The semicolon is called the declaration separator. After this semicolon, we can hit enter and we can write some other CSS rules. For example, we can change the font size, 20 pixels, save. Let's add some more. Let's add like 50 so you can see. There we go. Our font size changed to 50 pixels. Now let's talk about why CSS is called cascading style sheet. What does cascading mean? Cascading refers to the rule that the styles follow. Let's say we have multiple rules for the same element. Which CSS rule will be applied? Imagine these styles fight for the same spot. Which one of them will win? There has to be a way to determine the winner, and there is. The rules are as follows. Let's go back to our index HTML. So rule number 1 is called the rule of origin. Where is the style defined? Is it inline, Is it internal or is it external? So let's say I will style this h1 in multiple ways. First, we have an inline style here. We're giving it a color of green. So let's say in our internal CSS in the head section, let's change this h2 to be h1. We are going to style the same h1 with a different color. And let's go to our main CSS. Also style the h1 with a different color. I'm going to delete this font size. And let's save this. And let's save our index HTML as well. So let's see who wins. So as you can see, the green color wins because the inline styles are the most important one. The inline styles are the highest ranking, so to say. Let's see what happens if we delete this style. Let's save it. Color will change to blue. So the next in line is the internal CSS, this one right over here. Let's say if we delete this, or let's just comment it. I'm gonna hit Control and /, and this is how we comment in CSS. We open up / and the star, and we close it down with a star and /. Now let's save it. Now we are going to see that the style from the external source will take effect. So this is the rule of origin. Number 1 is the inline style. Number 2 is the internal styling. And number 3 is the external style. Another rule is the rule of order. What was defined last? Let's say, for example, here in our main CSS, we have h1 color orange. I'm going to write h1 color blue, h1 color red. Let's save this. And as you can see, the h1 color changed to red. This is because when multiple CSS rules have the same weight, the last rule specified wins. In this case, the last rule is the color red. If I delete this and save it, this will change to blue because the last rule is blue. If we create another CSS file and import it, let's go here to our CSS folder and create new file, main2.css, enter. In our index, copy this line with Alt, Shift, and down arrow key. And I'm going to change the rule here to main2.css, save it. And inside here, let's write h1 color pink, save. And this will change to pink because in our index, the main2 CSS comes after the main.css. So let's see what happens if I change the order. With Alt and up arrow key, I'm going to push it up and make main2 to be the first one. And I'm going to save it. As you can see, the h1 changed color to be blue because inside our main CSS, blue is specified. So now you know the rule of order in which CSS styles are applied. The next rule is called the rule of specificity. How specific is the CSS rule? So the least specific CSS rule is when we specify only an HTML tag. Like for example, h1, color is blue. The next way to be more specific is to add an element before the h1. For example, we can see that in our index, before the h1, we have a body tag. So let's say in our main CSS, in the first line, before the h1, let's write body h1 and save it. Let's see what happens. As you can see, the colors changed to orange. Even though color blue is the last color specified for h1, body h1 is more specific, so the orange color will take effect. Another more specific way is to add the class attribute to the h1 in our HTML file. Delete this style here, add the class tab, and here we have to specify a class name. I'm going to write color red. Let's save this. We reference the class in our CSS with a dot symbol. Dot color red. Open up the curly braces, enter. Inside here, we are going to specify color red, and let's save it. As you can see, our heading 1 changed to red, even though it's only one selector, and this body h1 has 2 selectors. Class is a more specific way to style our HTML. Classes can be used on multiple elements to add specific styles to them. For example, let's go back to our index.html. And I'm going to copy the class and I'm going to add it to my paragraph as well. Add it to the block quote, save it. You will see that our paragraph and block quote change colors. I can add it to my h6 as well, save it. and this is a clean way to add one style to multiple elements by referencing it with a class. Another more specific way to add a style to an HTML element is the ID attribute. On this h1, after the class, let's write ID tab h1-id. Save this. Going to go back to my main CSS. Before the class, we reference an ID in CSS with a hashtag. So I'm going to write hashtag h1-id, and inside I'm going to write color green, and I'm going to save it. As you can see, my heading changed color to be green. Even though the class is the last style, ID is more specific, and this will take effect. Even if I say body and class color red and save it, ID is the most specific way to target an element. So an important note here, classes are used for styling multiple elements. IDs are used to target only one specific element. And the last rule is the rule of important. This rule overrides everything. So let's go back to our main CSS. Right on the top, let's say h1 color pink, and I'm gonna write exclamation mark important and save it. You can see that our h1 changed color to pink. Even though it's not that specific, not a class, not an ID, it's the first element that we're specified, and still important overrides everything. Even if I go to index and say here on my h1 style equals color black, save it, it won't change it. If I comment this and save it, my color will be black because the inline style is more important than the external CSS rules. But if I specify important, it will override even inline style. So this is it. These are the 4 rules that we need to know in order to understand how CSS works. Now let's talk about best practices. How can we use these rules correctly and in a way that is widely accepted amongst developers? So tip number 1, don't use inline and internal styles. It is a best practice to separate the styles from the HTML structure. So basically what this means is to use CSS files to style our pages. Inline and internal stylings are considered bad practice and are only used in some special corner cases. When, for example, you don't have access to CSS files, you can add styles only with JavaScript. So I'm going to delete our inline styles, delete this one, and I'm going to delete this one from the head as well. And I'm going to save it. Tip number 2, it is considered a bad practice to use important in your styles. Don't use it. So don't use important. Only developers who are lazy and don't understand how CSS rules work use this. You only use it if there is no other way. For example, you don't have access to your HTML or JavaScript files and you have to overwrite an inline style from the external CSS files. I cannot stress it enough. Important is used only as a last measure. It's like an atomic bomb. You have to exploit all other options first. Important can be overwritten only by a more specific important. So there you go. With important, you have great power in your hands. The fate of CSS hangs in the balance, so use it wisely. I'm going to delete this right away. Tip number 3, don't use unnecessary chaining of HTML selectors just for the sake of using it. For example, we have something like HTML, body, h1, class. So let's go back here and say HTML, body, h1, color, red, and write something like color red. Save it. This won't take effect because we have an ID right over here. But if I change this to ID, h1, ID, save, my h1 will change to color red. So this is what I mean by don't use unnecessary chaining. This is a chain of HTML elements, classes, and IDs. This is considered a bad practice. In some cases, you will need to use some kind of chaining. For example, like I used it here, body and a class. But as a rule of thumb, if you find yourself using more than 3 selectors, then there is something wrong with your CSS rules. Try finding other solutions. For example, adding a class or an ID. This is perfectly fine just to use ID here in this case. So this is it. We laid down the foundations for CSS. I know that I talked about many rules in this tutorial, but these are really important concepts to understand. So if you want to be a great developer, you have to know all these rules. I advise you to experiment and exercise with these concepts. Watch the video more than one time and create a solid CSS foundation for yourself. Let me know if these tips were helpful in the comments or if you have other best practices that you use. In the next video, we will talk about more HTML and CSS building blocks, so stay tuned. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. As always, thanks for watching and see you in the next one.